It is unsettling to realize that some of history's most powerful shifts were shaped by women the world was never meant to remember. Their names faded, yet their sons altered the fate of a kingdom. Their footsteps were soft, but their shadows stretched across the Tudor throne. What happened to those who birthed princes but never wore crowns? And why were they never allowed to vanish completely? Tonight, walk with me into the quiet edges of their story. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If a quiet chamber ever held the power to shift the course of a woman's life, it was the one where a Tudor mistress first realized she carried the king's son. The moment rarely came with celebration. It arrived in whispers, in the tightening of her breath, in the stillness that fell over her as she touched her stomach and understood that she was no longer only herself. Before this, she had moved through the palace like a shadow, seen, desired, but never truly counted. Now, the faintest possibility of a child began to alter the way she stood, the way she watched the door, the way she measured every passing hour. She knew too well that a son meant survival, and a son meant danger. Until this point, her presence in the king's life had been little more than a passing warmth. Mistresses were conveniences, not commitments. They existed in the margins of court life, close enough to be summoned, distant enough to be forgotten. A mistress without a child could be replaced by a softer voice, a younger face, a new fascination. The palace expected such exchanges and did not question them. But a mistress with a son unsettled the order of things, because blood had a weight that affection never carried. The early days of her pregnancy brought no assurance. Instead, they were filled with long hours of silence. Servants moved differently around her, not with respect, but with curiosity. Rumors began to slip through corridors with a softness that made them all the more dangerous. The king did not speak of the matter directly. He watched her with a measured gaze, as though calculating the value of what might grow inside her. His silence felt heavier than his words ever had. In a world where women were expected to be quiet, her quietness now had the force of diplomacy. Her body shifted before her status did. At first, she felt changes only she could detect. The fatigue, the tremor of fear beneath her ribs, the suspicion that her future narrowed and widened at the same time. If the child were a daughter, she would fall back into obscurity. If it were a son, she would be pulled into the cold, the bright center of attention. It was a strange tension. She lived every hour between vanishing and becoming visible. Yet something else moved under the surface. The midwives who rarely looked her in the eye now asked gentle questions. A royal physician appeared in her rooms without being summoned. Guards paused longer near her doorway, pretending to adjust their boots or armor. It was not care. It was surveillance, and it reminded her of her position. Her body, once entirely her own, now belonged partly to the king and partly to the realm that waited for male heirs like thirsty ground waits for rain. As the pregnancy progressed, the court shifted around her, even when no one spoke of it openly. A lady in waiting, who once avoided her in fear of scandal, now offered small kindnesses, an extra cushion, a warm drink, and an evening visit filled with polite conversation. These gestures were not friendship. They were cautious, the instinct of someone who sensed that this woman might soon matter. In Tudor courts, proximity was currency, and everyone sought to gather it before they knew its true value. Outside her chamber, the palace carried on with its noise, ministers arguing, courtiers flattering, priests blessing, children of noble families running across stone floors. But beneath it all, there was a new current. Some prayed for a daughter, hoping her insignificance would keep the king's attention undisturbed. Others prayed for a son, calculating the opportunities that came with a new branch of royal blood. People who had never spoken her name before now whispered it behind their hands. When the pains began, and the midwives gathered, the palace held its breath. She had no titles to protect her, no legal standing, no vows spoken before an altar. But in those hours, she carried something more potent than marriage itself: possibility. The king paced outside her chamber. Not because he loved her, but because history waited on the other side of the door. It was a strange comfort, knowing that her value depended on an infant who had not yet taken a breath. The moment the child's cry broke through the air, her world changed. The midwife's trembling voice announced that it was a boy. It was only a whisper, yet it seemed to echo through every stone of the palace. A boy meant she would not fade. A boy meant she had entered a realm beyond desire, beyond decoration, beyond the fragile sweetness of affection. She was now the mother of royal blood, and even those who despised her would have to look at her differently. The king entered the chamber slowly, as if approaching a relic. He did not speak to her first. He looked at the child, the small, wrinkled face, the trembling fists, the faint cry, and in that moment, she understood that her life would never return to what it was. She was still not a wife. She would never be queen. But she was no longer invisible. A son had rewritten her fate with a single breath. It was a quiet transformation, born in a room where no one had expected power to take root. And though the change seemed gentle on the surface, something deeper had already shifted beyond her control. There were those in the palace who had begun to watch her differently, wondering how far the shadow of her child might reach. There was a quiet, stillness to the lives of women who found themselves in the king's company, but held no claim beyond his momentary favour. Their days unfolded in narrow rooms, half-lit corridors, and gatherings where they were present yet never truly acknowledged. A mistress without a child lived in a suspended state, cherished for an evening, dismissed by morning, and expected to smile as though none of it marked her. Everything depended on the king's shifting attention, and nothing she possessed, not her beauty, her charm, nor her patience, belonged securely to her. It created a strange kind of existence, one defined more by absence than presence. She was granted no title to steady her place, no documents to protect her, no promises that could withstand the cool air of dawn. Those around her treated her with a politeness so thin it almost broke under the weight of a single careless glance. Even in the king's gaze, there was a flicker of instability, a sign that affection was only a temporary shelter. When he turned away, the warmth disappeared instantly, like breath fading on glass. A mistress who had not carried a child existed only at the edge of the court's vision, and edges were dangerous places in Tudor life. Each morning, she dressed without knowing whether she would be invited to dine, walk, or simply vanish from the king's thoughts. There were days when he sought her out with a sudden tenderness, and others when she waited for hours, listening for footsteps that never came. The unpredictability carved hollows inside her, spaces where doubt settled quietly. She learned to move lightly, to speak carefully, to exist in a way that made her easy to summon, yet easier to overlook. Her value rose and fell without warning, as delicate and fractured as frost on a window. Those who served in the palace recognized this fragility. Some offered her respectful nods, others avoided meeting her eyes. They knew she was neither noble nor insignificant, but something in between, a figure suspended on the king's desire. In private conversations, her name appeared without attachment, spoken as though she were one of many indistinguishable silhouettes drifting through the palace. It was not cruelty, it was habit, shaped by years of watching mistresses come and go as quietly as the turning of seasons. Her position depended on the king's mood, and moods were as unpredictable as storms rolling across the English coast. A misplaced comment, an evening of distraction, a new face glimpsed at court. Any of these could loosen whatever tenuous hold she had. Even her smiles carried caution, for joy expressed too boldly might be seen as ambition, and ambition from a woman with no formal status was unwelcome. She lived within a narrow frame, allowed to shine only enough to please, never enough to threaten. She knew the stories whispered by other women, how a single misstep could send a mistress into obscurity overnight, how quickly the king's affection might tilt toward another. Youth, novelty, a different laugh, a softer gaze. These were currencies that could erase her. There had been others before her, charming and bright, who had decorated the king's days and were then quietly escorted out of his life with only a small gift or a brief farewell to show for it. The palace remembered them only faintly, and sometimes not at all. Her own reflection became a reminder of this precariousness. Each time she looked into a mirror, she wondered whether the king still saw something worth returning to. She examined the curve of her cheek, the fall of her hair, the softness of her voice, knowing that any of these could fail her. It was a strange loneliness, to be so close to power and yet untouched by its protections. She stood in rooms filled with light, but felt the shadow of impermanence settle over her like a thin cloak. Even the kindnesses she received carried a quiet warning. When a servant brought her warm wine or a tapestry to shield her from the cold, she sensed the unspoken caution behind the gesture. They had seen mistresses fall swiftly, like candles snuffed out by a sudden draught. Their gentle words were not affection but preparation, as though reminding her that she should expect little and accept whatever came. She sometimes tried to imagine a different life, one where her presence mattered beyond a fleeting desire. But imagining was dangerous. In the Tudor court, hope without foundation could cut more deeply than disappointment. So she remained steady, graceful, careful, allowing herself no illusions. She walked through the palace with the quiet understanding that she was temporary, a figure painted lightly onto a canvas that could be wiped clean without leaving a trace. There were nights when the king called for her, offering warmth and conversation that felt almost tender. In those moments, she allowed herself to breathe a little more fully. But even then, the knowledge lingered beneath the surface. Affection was not security, and desire was not permanence. When the candles burned low and the palace fell silent, she returned to her rooms with the same thought pressing against her ribs. She existed at his pleasure, and pleasure could fade. Without a child, she remained a flicker in the palace halls, a presence acknowledged only in passing. She was visible when summoned, invisible when dismissed, and in a world shaped by lineage and heirs, invisibility was the most fragile place of all. It was a life measured by glances rather than promises, a presence that could shift to absence without a sound. And in the quiet distance between those moments, something heavier waited to emerge. There were already signs that change would come from a direction she had not yet dared to imagine. There was a subtle shift in the air around her long before anyone spoke of it openly. The quiet routines of her days, moving through narrow corridors, sitting beside cold hearths, waiting for summons that sometimes never came, began to change in ways so delicate that only someone living in her fragile position could feel them. A missed cycle, a lingering heaviness in her limbs, a tightness beneath her ribs that would not ease. She understood before anyone else did, and the understanding settled over her with both weight and warning. In the Tudor world, a pregnancy was not merely a personal matter, it was an intrusion of politics into the most private corners of a woman's body. The first to notice her condition were the women closest to her. A maid paused longer than usual while lacing her gown, her hands hesitating at the curve that had not been there weeks earlier. A lady in waiting watched her pale in the morning light and asked if she had slept poorly. These questions held no kindness, only calculation. If the child belonged to the king, the entire palace would shift. If it did not, she would be cast out with a speed that would leave no time for protest. In such a place, even sympathy carried sharp edges. Soon, the whispers reached the people who mattered. The king's physician arrived without announcement, examining her with a quiet scrutiny that felt colder than any winter draft. He did not speak of joy or reassurance. Instead, he measured risks, outcomes, and responsibilities. His silence told her what she feared most, that her condition had already slipped beyond her control. A pregnancy tied her future directly to the king's decision, acknowledgement or abandonment, protection or peril. The king himself did not confront her immediately. Instead, he observed her from a distance, studying the faint changes in her posture, the newfound stillness in her eyes. His gaze carried the weight of a man calculating consequences. A mistress without a child was a fleeting comfort. A mistress carrying his child, especially a possible son, demanded choices he could not postpone. His uncertainty became a quiet pressure that settled over her days. She moved through the palace, aware that her fate hung not on her character or her desires, but on what grew inside her. As her condition became unmistakable, the atmosphere around her sharpened. Guards stationed near her chambers straightened their posture, their eyes following her in a way they had not before. The palace staff began to appear more frequently in her rooms. Servants with cups of broth, midwives summoned under vague pretenses, attendants offering small gestures that were not quite service and not quite surveillance. Their attention held no affection. They were watching her for what she represented, not who she was. The walls of her chamber, once indifferent, now seemed to listen. Conversations outside her door fell to hushed tones. Courtiers passed by with deliberate slowness, hoping for a glimpse of her expression, of any clue that might be traded as gossip or used as leverage. In the Tudor court, information was as valuable as coin, and her body had become a source of both. Her privacy dissolved quietly, the way sugar melts in warm water, quickly enough to notice, too slowly to stop. Nights became the most difficult. Alone in her room, she felt the full weight of the transformation taking place inside her. She had once been guided by desire, the brief warmth of the king's presence, the small comforts of proximity to power. Now her thoughts circled questions with no gentle answers. Would the king claim the child? Would he cast her aside to avoid scandal? Would the court accept her new position? Or would it close in around her with a hostility sharpened by fear of change? Her breath grew shallow at the thought, and she often slept lightly, as if any sound in the dark might signal the moment her world tipped one way or another. It was not long before she understood that her pregnancy had pulled her into the center of political sightlines. People who had once ignored her now evaluated her with subdued intensity. Advisors and council members spoke the king's name more frequently near her, watching for reactions. Foreign envoys asked subtle questions. Even the queen's household shifted in response, though indirectly, through rearranged schedules and sudden whispers that moved like threads through the courtyard. Her existence had acquired a new meaning, one that stretched far beyond her intentions. She moved through this altered world with caution, placing her hands lightly over her abdomen as though to steady both herself and the child she carried. No one offered reassurance, because reassurance was a luxury reserved for women with legitimate standing. She had none. And yet, despite the uncertainty, there was a new steadiness within her, a sense that the life growing inside her was reshaping the boundaries of her fate. She could not control what the king would decide, but even in silence, her pregnancy had begun to command attention. There were moments when she sensed the old tenderness in the king's eyes, the warmth that had once drawn her into his private chambers. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the presence of duty and expectation. A king could indulge desire, But responsibility was another matter. The future of the realm, its heirs, its alliances, its fragile balance, pressed upon him, and she felt those pressures mirrored in the way he held himself near her. Close, but not too close. Concerned, but not yet committed. Her body, once merely an object of affection, had become a vessel of uncertainty, and uncertainty had always been dangerous in the Tudor world. Each day carried the weight of two possible lives, one in which she rose into a new, complicated visibility, and one in which she vanished with little more than a whisper in the palace corridors. Either path could unfold without warning. It became clear that pregnancy had shifted her world into a place neither desire nor caution could fully prepare her for. And while she navigated this fragile threshold, the palace waited quietly for what her body would eventually reveal. Somewhere beyond those waiting eyes, a deeper reckoning had begun to gather its shape. A quiet realization drifted through the palace long before the news reached the wider court. The newborn in her arms was a boy. The midwife whispered it first, her voice thin and unsteady. Yet the single word carried through the chamber with a force that unsettled the stillness. A son, not merely a child, not simply another body brought into the world, but a living thread tied directly to the royal line. In that fragile moment, the woman who had once hovered at the margins of attention stepped into a visibility she had never sought, yet could no longer avoid. Becoming the mother of royal blood altered how people approached her. Their expressions held no warmth, only a sharpened curiosity shaped by caution. The boy breathed softly against her, unaware of the weight he had introduced into the air around them. She felt it immediately. The way guards straightened near her doorway, the way advisors paused mid-conversation when she passed, the way servants adjusted their tone with an unfamiliar restraint. They looked not at her, but at what her child represented: continuity, threat, opportunity. In a court defined by lineage, a son created a tremor that spread through stone, stairwell, and whisper alike. Those who once dismissed her now approached with care, measuring every word for how it might sound later. Those who envied her hid their resentment beneath thin politeness, afraid that any misstep might place them on the wrong side of emerging loyalties. Even those who had never spoken her name now carried it carefully, as though afraid it might shatter if handled too roughly. Her value had changed overnight, not through her own merit, but through the small, fragile existence swaddled in her arms. The king's gaze revealed a similar shift. He approached with a slower, more deliberate step, studying the boy with a gravity she had never seen in him before. He held the child with careful hands, his expression softened by responsibilities that neither of them could escape. Yet, even as he looked at her differently, a distance remained, a line drawn quietly by duty, expectations, and the kingdom's silent hunger for heirs. His affection mattered less than the future that the child symbolized. Her new visibility did not bring ease. It brought scrutiny. She felt it press against her like a cold wind. Courtiers watched her with sidelong glances, evaluating possibilities she had never intended to stir. Each bow held hesitation. Each greeting carried a hint of calculation. She had become important in a way that was neither comfortable nor safe. Her existence was tied now to the fragile assurance that her son lived, and that the king continued to see value in him. Servants moved differently around her as well. They offered warm broth with measured hands, adjusted blankets with rehearsed care, and stepped softly, as though afraid the slightest noise might disturb the quiet equilibrium surrounding mother and child. These gestures carried no affection. They were acknowledgments of power's shifting shape. She had not risen through favor or title, but through biology, through an accident or blessing, depending on who whispered the story. Beyond her chambers, conversations had already begun. Advisors entered the council room with sterner expressions. The Queen's household tightened its routines, not in open hostility, but in wary adjustment. Courtiers speculated about recognition, legitimacy, and the implications of an heir born outside the boundaries of marriage. Every question circled back to her, and yet none of them truly concerned her. They were concerned with the boy, his place, his potential influence, his capacity to tilt the future in directions no one could fully predict. And she understood that her survival now depended on him. As long as he lived, she carried a degree of protection the court could not dismiss. But she also carried risk. A mother of royal blood could be seen as a threat, even if she never spoke above a whisper. Her presence forced the court to acknowledge possibilities they preferred to ignore. Some would want to raise her, some would want to remove her. Most would simply watch, waiting to see where the boy's existence might lead. The child slept through these tensions, unaware of the invisible web tightening around his cradle. His breath rose and fell, in faint rhythms that softened even the harshest expressions. But softness had little place in the Tudor court. She knew that affection could not shield her. Only the child's continued value could. And so she moved carefully, each step taken with awareness, each gesture shaped by the knowledge that she no longer blended into the palace's quiet corners. She had become a figure others counted, measured, and marked, not because she sought power, but because she had given birth to it. It became clear that the court no longer viewed her as a passing comfort, but as a presence tied to the kingdom's delicate future. And beneath the murmurs gathering in the hallways, a deeper unease began to take form, stirred by those who feared what her son's breath might one day signify. She did not wear a wedding ring, nor did she possess a title that steadied her place among the noblewomen who moved through the court with practiced confidence. Yet something in the air around her had shifted. The birth of a son had carved her name, quietly but permanently, into the consciousness of those who once regarded her as little more than a passing presence. She walked through the palace with the same steady steps as before. Yet people now paused when she passed, their eyes lingering a moment longer than politeness required. It was not admiration. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in the Tudor world was a rare and delicate thing. Her life had once been measured by fleeting moments of the king's affection, moments that dissolved as quickly as steam rising from a winter cup. Now, the child's existence extended her shadow across rooms she had never entered, across conversations she would never hear. She did not sit at the council table, nor did she speak in gatherings where decisions shaped the realm. Even so, her presence became part of the unspoken landscape in those spaces. Advisors spoke of succession with careful restraint, conscious that the boy represented both stability and uncertainty. In the quiet corners of those discussions, her existence hovered like a faint but persistent outline. The king rarely put these thoughts into words, but his behavior betrayed the shift. He visited her chambers more regularly, not with the urgency of desire, but with the contemplative stillness of a man recognizing his own legacy. When he looked at the child, something in his posture softened, and she felt the gravity of that change settle over her. He did not offer promises. Promises were fragile things in royal hands. But he offered presence, and presence could be far more binding. The court watched all of this with the subtle attentiveness of a body sensing its own transformation. Some courtiers bowed to her a fraction deeper, not enough to be remarked upon, just enough to be remembered. Others maintained a safe distance, wary of appearing too eager or too indifferent. In a world held together by perception, even the smallest gesture had weight. She understood that these shifts were not for her sake. They were for the child. Yet through him, she found herself holding a place no one could quite erase. The boy's earliest movements, his first attempts to grasp a finger, his quiet sounds in the cradle, seemed to echo beyond the nursery walls. Servants spoke of him with a restrained pride, as though his existence made their duties more significant. A nursemaid mentioned him softly in a hallway one morning, her voice carrying the tone of someone discussing a future that might one day matter. Even those who had never shown her kindness now offered her greetings they had once withheld. None of this changed her status in the legal sense. She remained unmarried, unofficial, unrecorded in the genealogies that shaped the lineage of monarchs. And yet, she was no longer forgettable. She sensed the strange duality of her situation. She lived inside a fragile space, elevated by the child and yet vulnerable because of him. Her position rested not on tradition or law, but on breath. Her son's breath, soft and steady against her shoulder when she held him. If he thrived, her place held. If he faltered, she would sink back into the quiet anonymity from which she had emerged. It was a precarious kind of visibility, one that could warm her or scorch her, depending on how the future unfolded. Yet even in the uncertainty, there was a quiet endurance taking root within her. She learned to carry herself with a composed stillness, aware that any display of ambition could turn attention into suspicion. She did not ask for recognition. She did not seek influence. She simply existed more firmly than before. Her presence, traced by the outline of a child whose pulse shaped her own. The palace began to treat her as though she stood at the edge of something significant. She was not invited into the grand chambers, but she was not kept out either. Conversations near her quieted, not out of disrespect but out of caution. People gauged her reactions, wondering how attuned she might be to the shifting currents of court life. Though she rarely spoke, her silence carried more weight than any words she could have offered. A woman without a crown rarely commanded attention. Yet she did. Subtly, unintentionally, inevitably. As seasons turned, her place in the palace settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and enduring. She knew she would never walk beside the king as a wife. She knew she would never be celebrated in official records. But she also knew that her child's footsteps, small now but growing steadier with time, would leave marks on the history that had once excluded her. Through him, she had become a quiet, unspoken part of the realm's unfolding story. It became clear that her life had slipped into a permanence she had never expected, shaped not by vows, but by the small heartbeat she protected. And as the court adjusted around her, a deeper shift gathered quietly beneath its surface. There were hints of tensions forming where admiration blurred into caution, and where recognition shadowed the uncertain path ahead. Kings were expected to see the world through the narrow lens of duty. Yet their private lives often spilled into the political landscape with a force neither subtle nor avoidable. A child born beyond marriage, especially a son, stood at the crossroads of desire and calculation. The Tudor court understood this well. A king's affection could bring a child into the world, but only strategy could determine whether that child was acknowledged. Recognition was never a simple gesture. It was a decision made with the steadiness of a man, measuring not the child's innocence, but the realm's shifting needs. Some kings looked upon their illegitimate sons with a strange blend of restraint and reluctant pride. They saw in them a reflection of their own strength, a continuation of their bloodline, a possibility waiting quietly at the edges of power. When the political winds aligned just right, these kings spoke the child's name aloud, granting it a place in the world that others could not dismiss. Recognition did not soften the complexities of court life, but it wrapped the child in a thin veil of protection, one that signaled to others that this boy, though born outside the lawful path, stood closer to the centre than many dared to admit. A few kings went further, weaving titles into the lives of those sons with deliberate care. A dukedom, a lordship, a position crafted to reflect favour without threatening the legitimate line. These were tools in the royal arsenal. The court whispered their surprise. But no one openly challenged the king's decision. Titles served multiple purposes. They elevated the child, strengthened alliances, and redirected scrutiny. Yet none of these honours extended toward the mother. She remained outside the boundary of legitimacy. her life touched by the light cast upon her son, but never illuminated in her own right. She watched from the quiet margins as courtiers bowed to the boy, acknowledging a status she herself would never be permitted to share. Even so, acknowledgement came with its own dangers. A king who named his illegitimate son signaled both strength and vulnerability. Strength, because he held the power to reshape the social order with a single proclamation. Vulnerability, because others might interpret the gesture as readiness to overlook or replace lawful heirs. The court's reactions, subtle nods, tightened expressions, murmured conversations behind tapestries, revealed tensions that grew sharper whenever lineage was discussed. A recognized illegitimate son could inspire loyalty. He could also inspire fear. Not all kings chose the path of recognition. Some avoided the subject entirely, distancing themselves from the child with a coldness that bordered on cruelty. They weighed the risks carefully. To name the boy might unsettle alliances with neighboring powers, anger the queen's allies, or encourage factions eager to bend succession to their advantage. Silence, then, became the king's shield. He allowed the child to exist as a private truth, never denying him outright, yet never giving him a place in the architecture of power. These decisions were not personal. They were written in a language the court understood well. For the mother, these shifts were felt like temperature changes, sometimes warm, sometimes icy, never predictable. She watched the king with a cautious stillness, aware that her son's fate hung suspended between pragmatism and sentiment. She learned to read his expressions in small details, the momentary softness when he glanced at the boy, the tightening around his eyes when advisors spoke of foreign threats, the thoughtful silence that followed conversations about lineage. Each reaction carved a path toward acceptance or erasure. Recognition, when it came, altered the child's world instantly. He was moved into finer rooms, given tutors whose reputations carried weight, and dressed with care, meant to reflect the king's decision. The court adjusted its tone around him, smoothing its edges, restraining its judgments. A boy once unnoticed became a symbol, delicate, powerful, and watched with careful interest. His mother found herself in a new position as well. Though still outside the circle of legitimacy, she no longer drifted unnoticed through the palace. She was tethered to the child's future, for better or worse. When recognition did not come, the silence itself left marks. The boy grew in the shadows of court life, curious yet constrained, aware of his difference even before he had the words to describe it. And the mother felt the weight of that silence more heavily than anyone else. She understood that timing, alliance, war, and diplomacy all played roles in shaping whether her son's existence mattered to those who governed. It was a lesson taught, not by tutors, but by the quiet, calculated rhythm of life in the Tudor world. Through all of this, one truth remained unchanged. The king's choices were never about the child alone. They were about the demands of the moment, the balance of influence, and the fragile architecture of power that held the realm together. A son born outside marriage could be a solution or a threat, a symbol of vitality or a complication waiting to unravel. His mother stood at the intersection of these possibilities, bound to decisions she could never shape, yet forever affected by their outcomes. It became clear that recognition depended less on affection than on the shifting needs of a kingdom, leaving the boy suspended between privilege and uncertainty. And as those uncertainties deepened, a new tension began to form in the spaces where ambition watched quietly for its turn. The granting of a title to an illegitimate son carried a ripple powerful enough to unsettle every layer of the Tudor court. When the king bestowed such an honour, it was never merely a gesture of affection. It was a public announcement that the child stood closer to power than most men of noble birth. And among all these stories, one rose above the rest: the moment when Henry Fitzroy, born beyond the bounds of marriage, received a dukedom from his father, Henry of Them. It was an unprecedented act, one that shifted the court's understanding of lineage and loyalty with the force of a sudden storm. The acknowledgement alone would have been enough to stir unease. But a title, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, sent courtiers into a maze of whispered calculations. A duke held influence, land, and symbolic weight. A royal duke, even one born outside legitimacy, hovered dangerously close to the pathways of succession. The court understood what such a title meant. The king had extended his reach beyond the confines of marriage, placing a piece of himself into the world in a way that could not be ignored. For the boy's mother, Bessie Blount, the transformation unfolded like a slow illumination. Once a quiet figure drifting along the edges of royal favour, she stepped into a visibility she had never expected and could never have sought for herself. People who once overlooked her began to treat her with a cautious respect, not out of admiration, but out of recognition that she had borne something greater than her own name. Her son's elevation forced the court to re-examine their treatment of her, adjusting their tone, their greetings, and even their silence. It was through him that she received land, protection, and patronage, gifts that marked her not as a noblewoman in her own right, but as the vessel through which valuable blood had entered the world. Her newfound stability was delicate, bound to the child's standing rather than her own accomplishments. Even so, it was more security than most mistresses ever knew. The court's acknowledgement did not soften her isolation, but it carved her a space that could not be erased by a simple shift in the king's affections. This quiet shift in her life reflected a broader truth of the Tudor court. Power often arrived indirectly, drifting toward those who had never been meant to hold it. A mistress rarely carried influence, but a mistress who bore a titled son occupied a space the court could not comfortably categorize. She remained outside legitimacy, yet she held a thread that connected her to decisions shaping the realm. Her existence became a contradiction, unofficial, unrecognized, yet impossible to dismiss. People watched her differently now. Servants bowed lower than before, unsure how far courtesy should extend. Courtiers offered her brief, calculated compliments, the kind that acknowledged her importance without surrendering their own standing. Even those loyal to the Queen measured their words around her, careful not to reveal resentment in ways that might someday be used against them. She felt all these shifts without absorbing them, aware that they belonged not to her, but to the presence of a boy whose existence startled the court more than anyone dared to admit. The king's behaviour deepened this complexity. He visited his son with a warm pride rarely seen in public, and his affection softened corners of his demeanour that court life had long sharpened. Yet, when he spoke to the mother, there was still a boundary, clear, unyielding, dictated by the roles they occupied. She was not his wife. She would never be queen, but she was the mother of a duke, and that fact tied her to the realm more tightly than any vow could have. Outside her chambers, the court moved with a subdued vigilance. Foreign envoys whispered among themselves, aware that a noble son outside marriage could reshape alliances. Advisors studied the boy with a mix of admiration and apprehension, conscious that the king's favour could thrust a child onto paths tradition had attempted to barricade. In the quiet spaces between official duties, nobles debated the implications of this new presence, how he might strengthen or destabilize the delicate structure of succession. For the mother, the shift was emotional in a way the court could never measure. She had once feared invisibility, the possibility that her life would pass through the royal world without leaving a mark. Now she feared something different, the weight of being seen. Every kindness offered to her, every calculated greeting, every cautious glance carried an echo of her son's title. She lived in the shadow of the dukedom bestowed upon him, knowing that the court viewed her not as herself, but as the mother of someone they could neither ignore nor fully accept. Yet, even with the complexities, She recognized the small but undeniable truth. She had stepped out of the darkness, not into honor, not into equality, but into a strange and precarious visibility. Her life, once fragile and forgettable, had been pulled into the realm's memory through the simple fact of her son's name. It was not glory, but it was permanence. The one thing the court could never take lightly. It became clear that titles could reshape a woman's place even when her own name held no rank. A faint shift was already moving through the court, carrying whispers that blended caution with curiosity. Somewhere within those whispers, a quieter tension hinted that the boy's rise might awaken forces. None of them were prepared to confront. Respect in the Tudor court rarely arrived as a sudden revelation. It emerged slowly, shaped by subtle changes in tone, posture, and the quiet rearranging of social distance. For a woman who had once lived in the soft margins of royal desire, this shift felt almost unreal. She had spent years being addressed by her first name alone, spoken casually, sometimes carelessly, as though she were a passing decoration rather than a figure with any lasting place. But the birth of a son had altered the language surrounding her. People began to speak differently, not because they admired her, but because they no longer had the luxury of dismissing her. She noticed it first in the servants, whose words tended to reflect truth faster than those of nobles trained in diplomatic restraint. A maid who once murmured her name with routine familiarity now hesitated, replacing it with a careful phrase, "The prince's mother." The shift was small, almost whispered, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. Titles had not been given to her, but something resembling status had begun to take root in those three quiet words. Motherhood, specifically motherhood tied to royal blood, had lifted her into a new category, one shaped not by affection, but by necessity. Courtiers followed slowly, adjusting their voices with practiced delicacy. They did not approach her with warmth, but neither did they speak to her as they once had. They bowed slightly deeper, offered measured greetings, and avoided the kind of casual familiarity that might now be deemed inappropriate. Their expressions held caution, as though they feared misstepping in ways that could be remembered later. They did not respect her position out of fondness. They respected the implications her son carried. Even the smallest gesture reflected their awareness that she now occupied a space closer to consequence than insignificance. This new tone became most evident in formal settings. When she entered a room, conversation softened, not because she had become important, but because the presence of royal blood, however indirect, demanded acknowledgement. She was no longer viewed as a fleeting comfort. She was the woman who had given the king something the realm understood deeply, a continuation of lineage. Her name faded from daily speech, replaced by the identity shaped entirely around her child. It was as though her old self had been quietly removed, leaving only the version the court required. She felt the weight of this transformation each time someone addressed her with the title she had never been granted but could no longer avoid. Mother of the Prince. The phrase carried a strange mixture of elevation and confinement. It erased her individuality at the same moment it raised her above her previous station. She was no longer herself. She was a role, a symbol, an extension of her son's future. And yet, despite the ambiguity, she found a certain steadiness in this new identity. It gave her a place the court could not easily ignore. The king's behavior reinforced this delicate shift. He spoke to her with a calm attentiveness unfamiliar from their earlier encounters. His affection had grown more measured, shaped not by passion, but by recognition of her connection to the boy. She was not his equal, and the boundaries between them remained firm. But he no longer regarded her as a passing presence. His glances spoke of a quiet reliance, a subtle trust that she would guard the child whose existence carried so many implications for the crown. The Queen's household, too, adjusted with careful intent. They did not embrace her, but they recognized her with the politeness reserved for figures who had become unavoidably relevant. Whispers no longer followed her with the same carelessness. Conversations paused slightly as she approached. Not out of admiration, but out of precaution. The lines between acceptance and resentment blurred, creating an atmosphere heavy with unspoken thoughts. She walked through these shifting dynamics with a restraint shaped by necessity. Any show of pride would be dangerous. Any sign of ambition could be interpreted as a threat. So she maintained a calm, quiet composure, allowing the court to define her through the language it now used. Mother of the prince became both shield and identity, offering her a visibility rooted not in desire, but in lineage. Her child, unaware of these changes, slept peacefully in his cradle, his breath soft and steady. He knew nothing of the way his existence altered the palace's movements. He knew nothing of how nobles bowed more carefully, or how ministers softened their voices when speaking of him. He simply existed, fragile and unaware, while the world around him shifted in ways he would someday inherit. She understood that the respect forming around her was conditional, fragile, and easily lost. It was tied to the survival of her son, to the king's regard, and to the political climate that could shift with a single breath. Yet, for the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible. She had stepped into a space where the court could not simply erase her presence. She was bound to a future that carried both promise and danger, and the recognition she received, however thin, was real enough to shape her days. It became clear that her identity had begun to settle into a place the court could no longer overlook. A quiet shift was already spreading through the palace, as people adjusted themselves around her new presence. In the hush of those shifting boundaries, deeper uncertainties gathered with a patience that felt almost deliberate. Influence in the Tudor court rarely stepped into the light. It preferred the shelter of rooms where doors closed softly and conversations dissolved before reaching the corridor. For the mothers of royal sons, women without official rank yet tethered to bloodlines that shaped the realm, this hidden terrain became the only place where they could move with any sense of purpose. Their power was quiet, fragile, and easily denied. Yet it wove itself through the palace with a persistence others underestimated. They learned early that visibility could expose them to danger, but subtlety allowed them to breathe. Allies emerged slowly, often through gestures that seemed almost accidental. A nobleman paused a moment longer in greeting. A council advisor offered a remark tinged with curiosity rather than dismissal. A lady of high rank asked after the child with a measured politeness that carried more calculation than care. These interactions, small on the surface, formed the beginning threads of an unspoken network. The mothers recognized opportunity where others saw only formality, and they responded with the same quiet restraint that had kept them alive thus far. They understood how influence moved, not in proclamations, but in the drifting of loyalties shaped by necessity. This network grew through shared interests rather than open declarations. Each nobleman or advisor who connected with them had something to gain: a future alliance, a strengthened position, a chance to stand nearer to a potential heir. The mothers never named these exchanges as alliances, but the court felt their presence regardless. Conversations softened when they entered a room, eyes shifted, calculating how proximity to them might matter in the years ahead. In these subtle negotiations, the mothers found a space where they could protect their children without challenging the rigid structures that denied them authority. They learned how to lobby without appearing to do so. A carefully whispered suggestion about tutors, a brief remark about their son's progress in reading or writing, a quiet expression of concern about the company their children kept. These comments travelled farther than expected, landing in the ears of men who understood how a boy's upbringing might shape his future usefulness. The mothers did not ask for positions or titles. They asked for guidance, for structure, for the slightest tilt of attention toward their sons. And the court, wary yet intrigued, found itself adjusting in ways that never appeared deliberate. Education became one of the most delicate spheres in which its influence took shape. Though they held no formal authority, the mothers affected decisions surrounding tutors, schedules, and companions. They watched closely as their sons learned French, Latin, cours, etiquette, and the small disciplines that shaped a nobleman's life. They recognized the significance of every detail. A gentle tutor could soften a boy's will, a strict one could sharpen it. A companion of questionable loyalty could bend his future in dangerous ways. The mothers positioned themselves at the edges of these decisions, offering the kind of insights that advisors found surprisingly useful. As their sons grew, so did the quiet lines of communication surrounding them. Servants carried small observations. Tutors shared concerns with guarded honesty. Advisors asked questions in tones meant to appear casual. Through these exchanges, the mothers stitched together an understanding of court tensions long before they erupted visibly. They moved through the palace like shadows, present, aware, unthreatening, and yet somehow always near the center of unfolding events. Their influence was not universal. Some noble families viewed them with suspicion, uneasy with women who occupied undefined spaces in the hierarchy. Others dismissed them publicly while seeking their thoughts in private. The Queen's household remained cold. But even coldness could not entirely conceal caution. Every faction understood that a boy tied to royal blood could become a tool, a symbol, or a complication. And the woman who guided that boy, quietly, steadily, became someone they could not afford to ignore. Despite all of this, the mothers rarely appeared empowered. They still lived in modest rooms, still lacked formal titles, still walked with the posture of women, aware their positions rested on uncertain ground. But beneath that controlled exterior lay an intelligence sharpened by necessity. Their sons' futures depended on their ability to navigate corridors lined with ambition. They could not command armies or draft laws, but they could shape the character of a child who might one day influence those who did. Through silence and observation, through patience and precisely timed words, they wove a network that allowed them to protect what mattered most. It was not power as the court defined it, yet it was power all the same. Subtle, enduring, and deeply rooted in the instinct to safeguard a life that carried the weight of possibility. It became clear that influence took many shapes. Some so quiet they passed unnoticed until their effects settled into the palace itself. A slow tightening of interests had begun to form, hinting that the children shaped in these shadows might one day redefine the balance that kept the court uneasy. Survival in the Tudor court rarely depended on beauty, or charm, or even the king's fleeting affection. For a mistress who had borne a son, survival became something far more intricate. A patience shaped by instinct, a quiet reading of rooms, a constant awareness of the fragile space she occupied. She understood, perhaps more keenly than anyone around her, that motherhood had pulled her into a future larger than her own life. The child she held was not simply a continuation of blood. He was a small, unsteady axis upon which fortunes could tilt. She learned quickly that raising a royal son required a kind of watchfulness that moved beneath the surface of daily life. Every lullaby she whispered was softened for his ears, but sharpened for her own understanding. Every moment she chose to comfort him. She also reminded herself that she was not raising a boy alone. She was shaping a figure the court might one day attempt to claim. The tender gestures that marked her early motherhood carried a second, deliberate purpose: to steady the child against a world that had already begun to measure his value. Her presence remained unofficial, yet she found herself navigating a path defined by consequences rather than titles. Tutors, she suggested, were not chosen outright, but her voice lingered in the room long enough for others to hear. Books she asked about found their way into the nursery. The cloth she preferred for the child's garments appeared in discreet deliveries. She did not command these changes. The palace simply adjusted around her with a subtlety that disguised its own attentiveness. People who dismissed her earlier now listened in small, unspoken ways. This quiet shaping of the child's future was not ambitious in the conventional sense. It was necessary. She understood how quickly the court could fracture around a royal son, how factions could form, how alliances could twist, how her child could be used as a symbol for causes beyond his comprehension. So she strengthened him in the only ways available to her. She taught him gentleness first, then caution. She held him a little longer than necessary, not out of possessiveness, but out of the knowledge that she alone could offer him, the steadiness that the palace, with its shifting loyalties, never would. As he grew, her role shifted again. She no longer protected a fragile newborn. She guided a boy whose footsteps echoed softly in corridors that had once ignored him. Advisors took notice. Servants watched with a careful awareness. The boy's questions grew bolder, and with each one, she chose her answers with deliberate care. She did not fill his head with dreams of power. She gave him stories of resilience, patience, and survival. Stories designed to shape a mind that could withstand the ambitions of others. Nothing she did was dramatic. She moved with the same restrained grace that had allowed her to survive the years before his birth. But beneath that calm exterior, a grounding force had taken shape. She understood now that her child would someday belong partly to the realm, whether she wished it or not. And because she understood this, she prepared him quietly, weaving steadiness into his days in ways the palace never recognized as strategy. People around her began to sense the shift without fully comprehending it. They noticed the discipline in the boy's posture, the clarity in his eyes. They remarked on his calmness, unaware that it was the product of nights she spent whispering stories chosen to strengthen him. They saw a future forming in him and assumed it came from tutors, from lineage, from the king's occasional presence. They rarely thought to see her hand in it, yet her influence lay beneath all of it, like a steady foundation. Unseen but essential, the king observed the changes as well. He watched mother and child with an expression caught between pride and contemplation. He spoke little about her contributions, but his silence no longer held the indifference of earlier years. It held something closer to acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that her presence safeguarded the child in ways no court official could replicate. The king recognized that motherhood had reshaped her into someone the palace needed, even if it could never fully accept her. She never sought gratitude. She asked for nothing except space. Space to raise the boy. Space to exist without being erased. Space to hold her quiet role without interference. Through careful steps and deliberate restraint, she held her place in a world that had once refused to see her. She remained outside the legal structure of the crown, yet she guided a life that could one day influence it. Her strategies were simple: consistency, tenderness, vigilance. None of these were visible in the grand halls of the palace, but they shaped the rhythm of her child's days more powerfully than any decree. Without daring to challenge the order of things, she carved out a place in it, one quiet breath at a time. It became clear that her strength rested not in titles, but in the steady shaping of a boy who carried the weight of lineage. A faint shift stirred around them as the court began sensing a quiet resolve forming where others had once seen fragility. In that deepening stillness, forces beyond her reach prepared to test the stability she had so carefully built. Royal marriages in the Tudor court were built on ceremony, alliance, and the steady weight of expectation. Yet beneath the ordered surface, emotions rarely obeyed protocol. When a mistress bore the king a son, a quiet fracture appeared in the queen's composure. Subtle, controlled, but undeniable. She understood the implications more clearly than anyone else. A royal child, even illegitimate, carried a meaning that the court could not ignore. Her own position, bound by duty and lineage, trembled for a moment beneath the pressure of something she could neither erase nor openly challenge: jealousy was a private emotion in the palace, never spoken aloud, but visible in the tightening of posture, the careful phrasing of questions, the stillness that settled over the Queen's face when the child was mentioned. It was not simply the king's infidelity that unsettled her. Infidelity was almost expected in royal houses. But the arrival of a boy who represented what she might have failed to give. The court's reactions, layered with politeness, made the tension sharper. Courtiers bowed a little differently, spoke with a new caution, carried news down hallways with the restraint of people who understood the ground shifting beneath them. The Queen bore this shift with the dignity her role demanded. She could not dismiss the child, and she could not punish the mistress without risking her own standing. So she chose stillness, controlled, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. There were days when she allowed her gaze to remain on the floor a fraction longer, as if weighing the cost of acknowledging something she wished had never taken root. Other days, she lifted her chin slightly higher, reminding the palace of her unshakable place at the center of authority. Peace between the Queen and the mistress did not come from affection. It came from necessity. The palace was too small a world to sustain open hostility. Servants would whisper, advisors would speculate, and factions would form quickly around rumors. To avoid that, both women maintained the fragile illusion of coexistence. The Queen offered polite greetings when protocol required it. The mistress responded with lowered eyes and quiet restraint. Their interactions carried the delicacy of glass. Their silence filled with meanings neither dared voice. Yet beneath this surface, calm lived a deeper struggle. The Queen's need to balance her dignity with the political realities of her position. She recognized the danger of appearing threatened. Any sign of insecurity could be used against her by those who sought influence through the child or through his mother. At the same time, completely ignoring the child could be interpreted as neglect. So she positioned herself between two opposing truths, resentment and duty, and walked carefully along that narrow path. There were moments when she observed the child from a distance, her expression unreadable. A mixture of sorrow and calculation passed through her eyes, as though she were silently measuring what his existence meant for her own legacy. The boy's presence created an echo she could not silence. His laughter in the garden, his small footsteps in the corridor, the tutors summoned to him, all of it reminded her of the precarious balance between lineage and affection, between her crown and the king's wandering heart. For some queens, composure hardened into strategy. They studied the mistress with the same attention given to foreign envoys. They asked quiet questions, learning who visited her, who advised her, and who lingered near her son. They formed their own networks, weaving influence with practiced precision. Their goal was not to erase the mistress, but to contain her, to keep her world small, predictable, and safely distant from the throne. The court saw only a serene queen. Beneath that serenity lay a vigilant mind. Other queens carried their emotions differently. They felt the sting more acutely, losing hours to silent reflection. They struggled with the contradiction of living beside a woman who had done what they themselves could not. They endured the whispers, the comparisons, the steady pressure of being measured against a single moment in the king's private life. Yet, even these queens learned to wear restraint as armor. The court demanded it, and their survival depended on the ability to turn private anguish into public calm. In this atmosphere of layered silence, the mistress moved with care. She understood that the Queen's acceptance, however thin, was a fragile gift. A single misstep could turn tolerance into hostility. So she remained humble in the Queen's presence, never meeting her gaze too directly, never speaking of the child unless asked. Her awareness of these boundaries became part of the court's rhythm, shaping the delicate balance between two women, bound by a man and divided by circumstance. It became clear that the palace shifted its rhythm whenever these two women shared the same space. A quiet pressure crept through the corridors as restrained emotions shaped the air around them. Beneath that tightening calm, Unspoken tensions gathered with a weight that hinted they would not remain still forever. Visibility in the Tudor court rarely depended on beauty or affection. It depended on the presence of a child who could shift the balance of power simply by existing. The women who bore sons discovered that their names, once spoken casually, sometimes even carelessly, began to take on weight. They were mentioned in measured tones, referenced in council whispers, acknowledged in ways that had nothing to do with personal merit. Their connection to lineage altered their place within the palace in a way no charm or devotion ever could. By contrast, the mistresses who had no children moved like faint outlines through the court's daily motion. They were remembered briefly, then replaced by newer faces that drew the king's attention. Their presence lacked permanence, as though they had stepped into a room that offered warmth for a moment before closing its doors again. Without a child to tether their identity to the future, they drifted at the edge of significance, their names dissolving into the soft hum of forgotten seasons. Those who bore sons felt the shift immediately. Their steps echoed differently in palace corridors. Servants paused slightly longer in greeting. Advisors measured their words with new care. It was not affection. Affection had never defined their position. It was relevant. They had given the king something tangible, something the court could not dismiss, a continuation of blood, even without official acknowledgement. This alone drew a thin layer of protection around them. No one wanted to offend the mother of a boy who might, under the right circumstances, become useful. Meanwhile, the childless mistresses observed these changes from the sidelines. They saw how attention gathered around the others, how their own presence seemed to fade in comparison. Their attempts to hold the king's regard grew more delicate, shaded with an urgency that had not existed before. A single moment could undo years of closeness. They lived in a world where affection offered comfort but no safety, where the king's smile could warm them but never anchor them. The divide between the two groups widened quietly, shaped not by open rivalry, but by the court's subtle recalculations. A mistress with a son gained a kind of gravity. She no longer drifted. She held a place defined by the future, her identity intertwined with her child's potential, giving her a presence that stretched beyond the king's shifting desires. Even those who disliked her recognized the implication of her role. She stood closer to the realm's long-term concerns, and that alone reshaped how she was treated. The childless mistress, however, lived in a space that grew narrower with each passing year. She could become a memory even while still alive, her relevance fading the moment her presence no longer pleased the king. Courtiers learned not to invest too deeply in her. They understood she belonged to the present, not the future, and the court rarely valued the present unless it served a larger purpose. Her silence grew heavier, her gestures more cautious, her gaze more aware of the fragility surrounding her. The mothers, too, recognized the shift. They saw how the palace turned its head more quickly when they entered a room. They saw how nobles offered small bows, how servants watched the child with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They did not mistake this for genuine respect. It was conditional, fragile, tied to the boy's survival and the king's interest. Yet it existed, and that alone placed them above women who once stood beside them as equals. Some mothers felt this quietly, others held it like a shield. All understood its foundation. The child had changed everything. The child was the anchor that the court could not easily uproot. For the childless mistress, the days carried a different weight. She saw how a single birth had redrawn the palace's hierarchy. The lullabies sung at night, the tiny garments sewn in private chambers, the whispered hopes of nurses. These had done what years of affection could not. They created a boundary she could never cross. She remained bound to the present moment, while others became tied to the future. The court spoke of it softly. In fragments, she has a son. She may be needed. Her place is different now. These murmurs travelled through kitchens, guard rooms, and council halls. shaping the women's fates with a casualness that reflected the palace's unwavering logic. By the time the distinction settled fully into daily life, the line between them had hardened. One group stepped forward, tethered to a legacy. The other stepped sideways, fading into the background of a story that would not remember them. It became clear that a child had become the measure by which the court sorted those who endured from those who vanished. A slow rearranging of loyalties crept across the palace, gathering weight with each whispered acknowledgement of the boy's presence. Along that shifting ground, the consequences waited for the women who believed their place could remain untouched. Presence in the Tudor palace rarely required words. Sometimes it required only a child whose existence redirected the room's attention. For a mistress who had once moved through the court like a quiet echo, her son became a living reminder of everything the king had tried to separate into public duty and private indulgence. Each time the king saw the boy, whether in a corridor, a garden, or the carefully arranged space of the nursery, an unspoken thread tightened between father and mother. It was not affection alone that shaped this connection. It was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of something irreversible. The child carried her features in ways the king could not ignore. A tilt of the head, a softness around the eyes, a familiar curl of hair. These small traces formed the bridge she could not build with titles or authority. The boy's presence summoned her name, even when she was not there, and it stirred a memory the king could not fully suppress. The court noticed this subtle shift, sensing how the king's expression changed for a moment when he looked at the child. That fleeting softness, rare and tightly controlled, made the mother visible again without her needing to step into the room. Illness intensified the connection. When the boy fell sick, the palace held its breath, not because he was heir, but because he was a potential contingency. Physicians moved through chambers with forced composure, offering explanations wrapped in careful calculation. The king demanded updates, and with each report, the mother's place became more defined. Her worry, though kept private, gave shape to a bond the court could not dismiss. Advisors weighed the situation silently, knowing well that a child's frailty could draw the king's attention more sharply than any political petition. The mother understood the danger hidden in these moments. Illness could elevate her place in the king's thoughts, yet it could also threaten everything she had gained. So she stayed close, speaking softly, watching the boy's breath, holding herself steady in the presence of those who monitored every gesture. The court interpreted her composure as devotion, but she knew better. It was a calculation mixed with fear. A single mistake could be used against her, especially by those who wished the child were less significant. When the boy recovered, his first steps into the hall restored the quiet momentum she depended on. News of his resilience drifted across the palace, bringing her name along with it. Courtiers stopped her in passing with polite remarks about his strength. Advisors commented on his posture or the steadiness of his gaze. These observations were not compliments, they were assessments, and every assessment shifted a fraction of the court's attention toward her. As the boy grew, achievements replaced crises, a lesson completed with ease, a display of discipline during riding practice, a moment of unexpected charm before a visiting noble. Each success echoed through the palace with consequences she could not control. The king's approval, subtle but perceptible, reinforced her place as the woman who had produced something valuable. Even those who disliked her had to acknowledge the boy's impact. Every achievement was another thread binding her to the court's future. Royal celebrations magnified her visibility further. Festivals, ceremonies, and seasonal observances required the presence of those tied to the bloodline. However, indirectly, she found herself standing in rooms where she had once been unwelcome, holding her son's hand while nobles watched with expressions they attempted to disguise. They offered acknowledgements she had never received before. Small bows, measured greetings, and questions about the boy's education. The Queen's household adjusted its distance, not with warmth, but with a formality that confirmed her altered place. These public moments mattered more than the mother ever admitted. They placed her beside the child in the palace's collective memory. Even without a title, she became part of the visual rhythm of royal life. Servants carried tales of her presence into the lower halls. Visitors noted her quiet dignity. Diplomats whispered her name in their letters home. She remained outside the legal structure of the court. Yet she was woven into its daily functioning through proximity to the boy who could not be ignored. She walked through these experiences with the same calm restraint that had carried her through earlier years. She did not claim recognition. She did not seek gratitude. Her role existed only because the child existed. And she carried that truth with a steadiness the court mistook for humility. What they could not see was the constant vigilance beneath her composure. She knew that favor could turn as quickly as it arrived, and that her place depended on maintaining a careful balance between visibility and caution. It became clear that the boy's presence shaped her fate more profoundly than any allegiance she could form alone. A quiet current of attention moved toward her with each step he took, gathering momentum that neither she nor the court could easily restrain. Within that widening gaze, shadows of future expectations began to form with unsettling clarity. Threats in the Tudor court rarely announced themselves openly. They emerged in quiet shifts of attention, in the subtle stiffening of posture, in the way advisors exchanged glances that carried more weight than their formal words. When a king failed to produce a legitimate heir, the presence of an illegitimate son, once merely an inconvenience, sometimes even a curiosity, began to feel like a shadow stretching across the throne. The boy did not need to speak, act, or understand the world around him. His mere existence unsettled the balance of the realm. The mother sensed this before anyone dared say it aloud. She felt it in the way people watched her child, not with affection, but with calculation. Ministers and nobles measured the boy's every gesture, searching for hints of strength or weakness. His smile, his health, his curiosity, the way he held himself. Each detail became something for them to interpret, to fear, or to imagine using for their own ends. The palace, always a place of competing ambitions, now carried an added tension. The possibility that the future might pivot on a child the king had not intended to place near the line of succession. Whispers spread through the court like drifting smoke. They spoke of what might happen if the king's lawful line failed, if illness struck, if political storms gathered. Even those who denied caring about such possibilities glanced toward the boy with a caution that could not be concealed. Some saw a threat, others saw opportunity. All understood that the stability of the throne hung on delicate threads, and the presence of a royal son born beyond marriage could tug at those threads in ways impossible to predict. For the mother, the consequences settled heavily around her daily life. She found her movements watched with a subtlety meant to appear harmless. Servants lingered a moment too long near her doorway. Guards took note of who visited her rooms. Attendants reported her requests to people she would never see. The scrutiny arrived quietly, without accusation. Yet it pressed against her days with the weight of suspicion. She walked carefully, aware that even the smallest gesture might be twisted into something dangerous. Restrictions began to appear, soft at first. Invitations to certain gatherings faded. Access to particular corridors required new permissions. Advisors spoke to her with polite restraint, as though she had suddenly become both fragile and volatile. She knew the court believed it was protecting itself, not attacking her. The uncertainty surrounding the boy's place made caution feel like a necessity to them. But beneath their restraint, she sensed another motive: fear of what she might do if given too much space. Other factions, quieter but no less ambitious, saw her differently. To them, she represented a door that might someday open. They approached her indirectly, through gifts offered in her child's name, through small conversations about education, through sympathetic remarks masked as passing interest. They did not speak of the throne, but their intentions settled beneath their words like sediment. They hoped to position themselves near whatever future the boy might represent, should fortune turn in his direction. The mother understood the danger of all these angles of attention. She held herself steady, avoiding alliances that seemed too eager, keeping distance from flattery that felt rehearsed. Her life became a pattern of restraint. Careful words, careful posture, careful silence. She did not want power. She wanted safety for her child. Yet safety had become the one thing the palace refused to offer freely. She observed the king's reactions with particular care. Sometimes he looked at the boy with a softness that suggested pride. Other times, lingering uncertainty clouded his expression. He knew the consequences of acknowledging the child's political potential, and he knew the risk of ignoring it. Between these two truths, he wavered. His indecision, though hidden behind royal composure, fed the tension threading through the court. The Queen's household watched the situation closely. Every gesture, every rumour, every moment of the king's attention toward the boy passed through their hands, interpreted and reshaped before drifting back into the palace's atmosphere. Their caution intensified the silence surrounding the mother, pressing her into a space where she felt both too visible and dangerously easy to overlook. Even the child, unaware of the forces gathering around him, seemed touched by the tension. The palace reacted to him with a mixture of formality and hesitation, treating him as though he were both delicate and formidable. He played, he laughed, he mispronounced his lessons. But each small act carried consequences. The mother alone seemed willing to carry quietly. She did not dare let her fear show. Fear, in the Tudor palace, could be used as easily as affection, so she concealed it beneath stillness. The same stillness that had once allowed her to survive as merely a mistress. Now it protected her as the mother of a child whose existence pulled the court's attention in opposing directions. A hope for some, threat for others. It became clear that the boy's place in the realm existed at the edge of danger. Shaped by possibilities the palace pretended not to see, a delicate strain tightened around those who watched him, hinting that the struggle between caution and ambition would soon test the fragile equilibrium holding the court together. Public affection from a king was never simple. In the Tudor court, a gesture as small as a hand resting briefly on a child's shoulder could shift the weight of entire factions, drawing eyes that had learned to interpret meaning in every softened expression. When the king chose to lift his illegitimate son into his arms, whether out of genuine tenderness or momentary impulse, the palace reacted long before the mother had taken her next breath. A father's embrace became something far larger than affection. It carried implications the court could not ignore. She felt the consequences immediately. The room fell quieter. Though no one stopped moving, advisors straightened their posture. Ladies paused mid-step. Even servants, trained to look without looking, allowed their gaze to flicker toward the scene. In that brief moment, her child transformed from a boy playing among tapestries into a symbol, one that unsettled the fragile balance of political expectations. The king's touch drew a circle of attention around mother and child, a circle that warmed at first glance but grew sharp at its edges. For the mother, the moment held two truths that pressed against each other. She saw the softness in the king's expression, a rare easing of the tension that ruled his daily life. There was something human in the way he held the boy, something almost ordinary. But layered beneath that warmth was the undeniable reality that the king's body, his gestures, his smallest movements, were never private. They were messages, whether he intended them or not, and those who watched him interpreted every sign with the precision of men who believed their futures depended on it. Some observers saw danger. A child held in the king's arms could, under the right circumstances, be considered a shadow of legitimacy. Even if the king had not declared the boy an heir, The physical closeness unsettled those invested in protecting the line of official succession. Their expressions tightened, their calculations shifted, and their loyalties grew fragile. The Queen's household, in particular, interpreted public affection as a kind of encroachment, a quiet threat wrapped in the guise of paternal instinct. Others in the court saw an opportunity. The embrace hinted at potential influence, a future role, a place from which power could be negotiated. These courtiers watched the mother with renewed interest, imagining alliances she had no intention of pursuing. Their glances followed her more closely. Their questions softened at the edges. Their curiosity sharpened beneath polite conversation. The king's gesture had placed her beneath a light she never sought but could no longer step away from. She knew the danger of attention in a world built on interpretation. Attention could elevate, but it could also destroy. A moment of paternal warmth, misread by the wrong eyes, could be twisted into claims of ambition or impropriety. The mother had spent years surviving by minimizing her presence. The embrace forced her into visibility she had not chosen. She felt each stare like a pressure against her ribs, a reminder that affection from a king came wrapped in risk. When the king released the boy and stepped back into his role as sovereign, the air around them did not relax. It shifted, becoming something heavier, something shaped by silent conclusions. The mother bowed her head slightly, instinctively retreating into the posture that had protected her before her son's birth. She understood that her next movements had to be measured, her steps quiet, her voice carefully restrained. Any sign of pride could be interpreted as presumption. Any sign of fear could be used to corner her. Even the child sensed the shift, though he could not comprehend it. He clung to the warmth lingering on his sleeve, unaware that his small body had become a point of tension for a palace full of watching men and women. His laughter faded into a hush that the room refused to shake off. He was too young to know what it meant to be both loved and dangerous at once. That night, as the palace settled into its uneasy stillness, the mother sat beside her son's bed and watched him sleep. She recognized the contradiction of her situation. The embrace had protected him, yet exposed them both. She understood that she could not reject the king's affection. Such defiance would invite disaster. Yet she also understood that accepting it came with a cost she could not calculate. In the dim glow of the chamber's single candle, she felt the edges of her world tighten. She had learned long ago that survival depended on reading not the king's intentions, but the court's reactions. And in their reactions, she heard the quiet warning beneath the day's events. The king's affection could open doors, but it could also turn the palace's gaze into something predatory. It became clear that the warmth of a king's touch carried the weight of consequences far beyond tenderness. A tension stirred through the palace, as though each watcher had drawn their own silent conclusion from that brief display. Beneath the soft glow of shifting loyalties, uncertainty crept forward with a patience that threatened to reshape the ground beneath them. Social standing in the Tudor court often shifted without ceremony, changing direction the way torchlight bends against stone walls. Slowly at first, then unmistakably, for a mistress who had once moved through the palace like a shadow barely noticed. The birth of her son altered the ground beneath her feet in ways she had not prepared for. The same corridors where servants once passed her without acknowledgement began to carry a different rhythm. People stepped aside more readily. Greetings lingered a moment longer. Even the silence, once indifferent, held a new awareness of her presence. She did not mistake this for acceptance. The court rarely embraced anyone who arrived through unconventional paths. Yet she recognized that something had shifted in the space between disregard and reluctant interest. Invitations began to appear, first discreetly, then more openly. A small gathering, hosted by a noblewoman whose family relied on proximity to the crown. A supper arranged for advisors and their spouses. A seasonal celebration where presence mattered more than comfort. These invitations were not gestures of kindness. They were measurements of importance. Tests to determine how firmly her new position had rooted itself. At these events, she carried herself with quiet restraint. She knew her place had not been granted by rank but by circumstance, and circumstance could change with alarming speed. Her posture remained composed, her words careful, her gaze steady. She listened more than she spoke, learning the delicate patterns of alliances woven into polite conversation. Around her, noble women observed her with expressions shaped by curiosity, calculation, and a subtle edge of caution. They had no desire to befriend her, but they could not risk ignoring her. Some approached her with deliberate warmth, their smiles softening as they asked after her son's health or education. Their interest was transparent, yet she answered gracefully, letting them decide for themselves how close they wished to stand to the uncertain future he represented. Others maintained distance, while still acknowledging her. Small nods, measured glances, the faint courtesy that indicated recognition without approval. No one openly dismissed her anymore. Even disdain shifted into something more controlled, as though those who once overlooked her now feared misjudging her relevance. The most revealing encounters took place not in the center of grand halls, but along the edges of gatherings, near alcoves, beside tapestries, in quiet corners where formal eyes could not fully reach. Here, women and men alike approached her with questions wrapped in casual tones. They asked about her child's tutors, his temperament, and his relationship with the king. Their inquiries were framed as polite interest, but beneath each one lay a search for advantage. She answered with caution, offering truth softened by restraint. She understood that every word she spoke had the potential to be repeated, reshaped, or used. Slowly, these exchanges formed connections that were neither friendships nor alliances. They were bridges, thin, fragile, and shifting with the palace's mood. Yet they offered her something she had never possessed before: access. Through these peripheral relationships, she began to understand the currents of power that moved beyond the king's chambers. Nobles who once saw her as irrelevant now viewed her as a possible doorway to influence, however indirect, and some were bold enough to hint at their intentions, cloaking ambition in feigned sympathy or quiet admiration. She accepted none of these overtures openly. Her survival depended on neutrality, on never appearing to take sides. But she did not dismiss the information she gathered, the whispers of unrest, the subtle friction between families, the unspoken concerns about succession. Everything she heard became part of the quiet map she built in her mind, a map that helped her protect her son from dangers he could not yet fathom. What unsettled her most was the Queen's reaction. While the Queen maintained impeccable composure, she noticed how members of the Queen's household watched her more closely now, noting whom she spoke to and who approached her. Their stillness carried judgment, but their caution carried something else: recognition. They understood that the mother of a royal son had become, however reluctantly, part of the palace's political landscape. Her presence at social gatherings was not an indulgence. It was a consequence. In these rooms filled with polished floors and flickering candlelight, she discovered the fragile nature of her new position. Being invited did not mean being accepted. Being noticed did not mean being safe. Each event reminded her that she was walking through a space that saw her not as a woman, but as a symbol. Those who smiled at her were not drawn to her personality. They were drawn to the possibility that her son, quiet, observing, growing each day, might someday matter in ways the court could not predict. Yet for all the risks, these gatherings gave her something invaluable: visibility that could not be undone. The court now spoke her name in contexts that would outlast the king's shifting affections. The child had opened a door she could not have opened alone. And through that door, the court's hierarchy rearranged itself just enough to let her through. Barely, cautiously, but undeniably, it became clear that society's regard had shifted not out of admiration, but out of necessity, binding her to gatherings where intentions shimmered beneath polished courtesies. A quiet tension threaded through each meeting, signaling that these fragile connections would soon test the limits of her carefully guarded composure. Accumulating property in the Tudor court was never a simple matter of wealth. It was a declaration of survival, a quiet assertion of independence in a world where a woman without rank could be erased in a single afternoon. When a mistress received land, a pension, or a modest house from the king, the gesture meant far more than generosity. It marked the beginning of a parallel life she was expected to build, one that did not interfere with the court's structure, yet remained close enough to support the child whose existence complicated that structure. She learned quickly that property was not merely comfort. It was leverage. The king granted estates not out of affection, but out of obligation to the boy, ensuring that the child's mother would never fall into hardship severe enough to disgrace the crown. These grants were often quiet, recorded in ledgers few would read, delivered through intermediaries who spoke in neutral tones, but the mother understood the significance of each line inked in her favour. A parcel of land could anchor her existence in a way the court never had. With these assets came a new responsibility she could not ignore. She began to manage tenants, oversee repairs, and negotiate matters far removed from the confined world of her earlier life. Each decision, about harvests, about servants, about rents, shaped the foundation of her son's future. These tasks demanded attention, patience, and a careful understanding of the laws that governed property. She sought advisors quietly, selecting those who seemed disinterested in palace politics, men and women who could explain the intricacies without exploiting her inexperience. Their guidance became part of the framework she built around her child's security. In private, she studied documents with the same care she once reserved for reading the king's shifting moods. She learned to interpret clauses, to question valuations, to sense when someone attempted to manipulate her. The skills she acquired were not for her own elevation. They were for the boy who would one day inherit the consequences of every choice she made. She kept ledgers with steady handwriting, tracing the rise and fall of resources that now belonged to a life she had brought into the world. As her understanding deepened, she began shaping her assets into something more deliberate, a network of support that could withstand the unpredictable currents of court politics. She employed people loyal not to the crown, but to her household. She improved the land carefully, ensuring that it would produce income regardless of the king's future attention. She made decisions slowly, without display, knowing that the appearance of ambition could be dangerous. Her strength grew in silence, scattered across fields and houses that the palace rarely thought about. These properties became places where she could breathe, far from the whispering halls that watched her every step. On these estates, she walked freely, unburdened by courtly expectation. She oversaw the planting of orchards, the repair of walls, and the rhythm of daily work. Each improvement, each restored roof, each planted field reinforced her conviction that a stable future for her son required roots beyond royal favour. In these quiet spaces, she built something the court could not take from her without revealing its own injustice. Word of her growing autonomy travelled back to the palace in fragments. Some nobles dismissed it as irrelevant, others viewed it with suspicion, interpreting her careful management as a sign of ambition. Yet ambition played no role in her actions. She understood that the court could turn cold without warning, and she refused to let her child be left with nothing should the king's favour shift. The estates, the pension, the modest wealth she accumulated, these were her shield against a world that expected her to remain both grateful and powerless. In time, her household developed its own quiet influence. Servants who owed their livelihoods to her loyalty, tenants who spoke her name with respect, and advisors who recognized her careful stewardship. Together, they formed a separate sphere of stability. It was not power in the traditional sense, but it created a protective distance between her and the court's volatility. She did not flaunt this independence. She guarded it with the same stillness that had allowed her to survive the earliest years of her life with the king. The boy, growing within this parallel world, absorbed its steadiness. He learned the feel of open fields, the responsibility of land, and the rhythm of labor that supported his future. His mother watched him quietly, noting how these places shaped him differently from the polished corridors of the palace. She knew he would eventually be drawn back into the orbit of royal expectations, but she hoped the foundation she built would keep him anchored when politics threatened to pull him apart. Every piece of property, every account carefully managed, every quiet decision served a single purpose: to ensure that the boy would never stand unprotected when the realm decided to measure his worth. She built this safety not with titles or alliances, but with deliberate, patient steps that no one could trace easily. Her life remained precarious, but her preparation gave her a kind of resilience the court had never expected from her. It became clear that her quiet accumulation of stability created a shield stronger than the court understood. The weight of her preparations settled around her household with a calm that felt intentional rather than accidental. Beneath that calm, subtle tensions gathered, waiting for the moment when her independence would no longer be ignored. Influence passed from parent to child in ways the Tudor court rarely acknowledged. Legitimacy, titles, and lineage received far more attention than the quiet shaping of a boy's inner world. Yet it was in that quiet shaping that a mother's true power took root. Though she held no official authority over matters of state, she possessed something the court could neither regulate nor remove: an unbroken closeness to her son. It was within that closeness that she guided him, softly, steadily, toward a future he could not yet understand. Her influence began with small gestures, the kind that did not appear political. She corrected his tone when he spoke too sharply, encouraged patience when frustration sparked in his eyes, and praised restraint more often than boldness. These lessons, woven subtly into daily life, carried implications far beyond the nursery. She understood that the court admired confidence but exploited impulsiveness. She shaped her son accordingly, teaching him to observe before he acted, to listen before he spoke, to sense tension before it hardened into danger. In moments when the palace's noise faded and the child leaned against her shoulder, she whispered stories drawn from the edges of memory, stories of those who rose by understanding quiet truths rather than chasing loud victories. She did not warn him openly about the ambitions of others. Instead, she taught him to recognize sincerity from performance, to notice the difference between a bowed head and a lowered gaze. Her words lingered long after he fell asleep, settling into the spaces where character formed. Some evenings, when candlelight stretched shadows against the walls, when he asked questions she could not answer directly. Why did some servants speak differently when nobles entered the room? Why did certain advisors grow silent when the king approached? Why did the queen's household always maintain a precise distance from him? She offered explanations softened by caution, shaping his understanding without giving him the harsh truths he was too young to carry. Her restraint, however gentle, guided the formation of instincts that would one day protect him. As he grew older, her influence deepened into something more deliberate. She encouraged curiosity about books, languages, and histories that spoke of leadership, not as a birthright, but as a responsibility. She chose stories that highlighted moral complexity, where decisions carried consequences, and the strongest rulers were those who recognized the weight of their own choices. He listened with a seriousness that startled her at times, absorbing lessons she had not expected him to grasp so quickly. The court noticed his developing temperament long before they credited her for it. Advisors remarked on his composure, noting that he approached challenges without the impulsiveness expected of noble boys. Tutors praised his ability to consider multiple perspectives before answering questions, These traits, they believed, came from innate disposition or fortunate instruction. They rarely looked toward the mother whose presence shaped the hours the tutors did not see. Yet some observers, older ministers who had watched the palace shift over the decades, recognized the subtle guidance behind the boy's steadiness. They recalled queens, duchesses, and noble women whose influence had shaped rulers before him. And they understood that motherhood offered a kind of mentorship the court could neither forbid nor replicate. These men began to watch her with a different awareness, sensing that her quiet involvement might one day influence decisions made far from her presence. The boy himself grew increasingly drawn to her counsel, even as he entered a stage of life where independence pushed against childhood closeness. He returned to her with questions, shaped by uncertainties he could not voice elsewhere. He trusted her silence, knowing she would not repeat his doubts. He trusted her judgment, knowing she weighed her words carefully. And he trusted her presence, knowing she never acted out of ambition for herself, but out of concern for what lay ahead of him. This private mentorship shaped not only his character, but his future political posture. The patience she taught him became resilience. The caution she instilled became strategic thinking. The empathy she encouraged became measured leadership. Though no one saw her in council chambers or listening to foreign envoys, her voice echoed quietly in the way he approached power, shaping a worldview grounded less in entitlement and more in understanding. The court, gradually, began to feel the influence of her teachings in ways they could not easily name. The decisions the boy made, small at first, then larger, reflected perspectives that had never passed through the hands of official tutors. His responses to conflict carried a calmness that unsettled nobles who expected him to mirror the king's temperament. His ability to pause, to reconsider, to temper his reactions bore the unmistakable mark of someone who had been taught to value control over impulse. She watched these developments with a mixture of pride and quiet fear. Every sign of his growing maturity brought him closer to the dangerous world beyond her reach. Yet she also knew that her guidance had given him something far more enduring than property or public favor. She had given him the ability to navigate a realm shaped by tension and expectation without losing himself to it. It became clear that her voice, though absent from council chambers, had begun to shape the boy's choices in ways the court could not easily trace. A soft shift moved through those who watched him, revealing subtle signs of a mind molded by quiet guidance rather than public instruction. As that shift deepened, uncertainties gathered around his future, carrying the suggestion that her influence might surface at moments the realm least expected. Power arrived gradually, settling over the young man like a mantle he had been preparing for without fully realizing it. The court, once cautious in its observations, now watched him with a sharper, more deliberate attention. He had stepped beyond the uncertain years of youth and into a realm where his presence influenced decisions, alliances, and the shifting balance of expectations. His composure, quiet, measured, and unexpectedly mature, drew interest from those who had once dismissed him as a footnote in the king's private life. With his rising authority came an invitation extended not to advisors or noble relatives, but to the woman whose influence had been shaping him since his earliest breath. The palace summoned his mother back within its walls, no longer as a mistress hidden in modest chambers or as a tolerated presence on the edges of gatherings. She returned with a quiet steadiness, aware that the path she now walked had been carved by years of restraint, vigilance, and the deliberate shaping of her son's character. The court received her differently this time. Servants bowed with a respect that did not feel feigned. Ladies greeted her with practiced smiles, careful not to betray the curiosity tightening behind their expressions. Even the officials who once ignored her now inclined their heads with acknowledgement. She sensed the shift immediately. Her relevance had become rooted not in the king's affection, but in her son's authority She was recognized because she had helped shape a future the court now depended upon. Her rooms were spacious, the furnishings deliberate in their elegance, offering comfort without excess. This was not luxury for display. It was a statement, the kind of living space reserved for someone the palace had decided must be treated with care. She walked through it slowly, touching the polished wood, the embroidered fabrics, the quiet symbols of acceptance she had never expected to receive. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet strangely deserved. She had survived too much to be dazzled by comfort. In the weeks that followed, the subtle summonses began. Not formal meetings, not official inquiries, merely soft requests carried by attendants to visit the Queen's chambers or to sit privately with senior ladies whose influence stretched through council and ceremony alike. They asked about her son, but their questions moved far beyond affection. They sought insight into his temperament, his hesitations, his convictions. They wished to understand the mind that had begun to reshape the tone of court decisions. She answered carefully, aware that her words carried weight even in rooms meant for quiet conversation. Her voice, once disregarded entirely, now entered spaces where decisions were shaped before they reached the council table. She observed how these women listened, intently, searchingly, hoping to find understanding in her observations. Some of them respected her, others merely tolerated her presence. Yet all recognized that she held something they did not, a lifetime of knowing him in ways no tutor or minister could match. There were moments when the Queen herself sought her opinion. The Queen's composure remained as measured as ever, but her gaze carried a depth of consideration rarely shown to someone outside noble birth. She asked questions with precision, never revealing what conclusions she hoped to draw. The mother responded with the same quiet restraint that had protected her for years, offering honesty shaped by caution. She understood the delicate line she walked. Her son's growing power gave her influence, but influence easily provoked suspicion. The boy, now a man, welcomed her presence with a mixture of relief and pride. He visited her often, speaking openly in ways he no longer could with others. She listened, guiding him gently, her advice threaded with the patience she had taught him long ago. He valued her perspective not out of obligation, but out of recognition. She had shaped the steadiness others admired in him. She had been his first teacher, his quiet anchor, the only person who had cared for him without calculation. In time, she became something unexpected within the palace, a living witness to a period of transformation. Courtiers approached her with respect shaped by curiosity, aware that she had seen the kingdom from angles inaccessible to those born into privilege. Ministers spoke of her privately as a stabilizing presence, someone whose quiet observations offered clarity during moments of uncertainty. She never addressed herself as such. She remained silent, as she always had, letting others name her role as they pleased. Yet the truth was unmistakable. She had become part of the fabric of the realm, not through a title, not through ambition, but through a lifetime of shaping a man whose influence stretched beyond her reach. Her identity, once defined by secrecy and caution, now settled into a space the court could not deny. She walked through its corridors with calm assurance, aware that her place had been earned through patience rather than privilege. It became clear that her return had reshaped the palace's quiet balance, drawing new attention to every step she took. A steady weight gathered around her presence, hinting that influence no longer needed a title to be felt. With that gathering weight, uncertainties began to stir, suggesting that the realm might face turns shaped by her guidance more than anyone dared to admit. They had long stood at the edges of royal life, women whose names were rarely spoken beyond closed doors, women who entered the palace through affection rather than alliance. Yet when a son bore the king's blood, the silence around them began to lift, not in a triumphant blaze, but in a steady, deliberate shift, one that pulled them forward, into the faint glow of a recognition previously denied. Their gowns remained simple, their titles unchanged, but the court had learned enough to bow its head before anything tied to the future of the crown. Servants, who once brushed past them without acknowledgement, now paused just long enough to signal respect. Not fear. Respect. It came quietly, the way dusk overtakes daylight. A slow, certain settling of new order. The women felt it when walking through corridors where tapestries muted every footstep. They felt it in the watchful glances of ladies who once looked through them rather than at them. It was not admiration they received, nor sympathy, but an understanding of the invisible thread connecting them to the life the king might someday rely on. The palace, with its carved lintels and cold stone floors, held memory in its walls. It remembered forgotten queens and nameless mistresses alike, but it remembered sons even more. So when a child of royal blood began growing, the whispers around the mother soon changed shape. She became a figure the court could not ignore, not because she had asked for attention, she never did, but because the child she carried, held, and raised left an imprint across the political landscape broader than any gown or ceremony could. She did not wear jewels heavy enough to press into her skin. She did not sit upon a throne built for a crowned woman. Still, there were moments when the distance between her and the seat of power shrank. Subtle, yet unmistakable. A look from the king during a festival. A place offered at the far end of a dais. An invitation sealed with the crest of a house that once shunned her. These gestures were fragments of a shifting tide. Quiet but undeniable. Other women of the court studied her carefully. Some measured her presence against their own, searching for weakness. Others traced the arc of her rise with a mixture of envy and caution. But no one dismissed her. Not anymore. The court did not forget that she had brought forth a life that might, under the right storms, become a claimant, a leader, even a symbol. That alone altered her standing, weaving her into the palace's future, whether she wished for it or not. Her influence grew in ways that rarely left a written record. A nod was exchanged with a noblewoman who once refused to greet her. A messenger arriving at dawn with petitions meant only for the mother of someone significant. A strategic silence was kept during a feast, which carried more weight than any proclamation she could have spoken. Power, in her hands, was quiet, too quiet for scribes to record, but loud enough for the cautious to heed. And still, she remained outside the formal hierarchy. No crown, no oath, no procession marked her ascent. The transformation existed in the space between what was seen and what was understood. She was not elevated by ceremony, she was elevated by consequence. That, in the Tudor world, was often the strongest foundation of all. The court recognized this, even when pretending not to. In private, she moved through her days unchanged in posture, yet changed profoundly in position. Her steps carried a weight they never had before. She placed her hands upon the back of a chair, with a steadiness learned from surviving the palace's cold seasons. She listened more than she spoke, knowing every quiet gesture now rippled through the chambers of influence. She had learned that visibility was not granted, it was shaped, forged in the small spaces where others looked away. And without a wedding veil, without a title carved into parchment, she found herself standing in the subtle glow of a status earned through endurance, risk, and the single life she had delivered into the world. The crown did not rest upon her head, but its shadow passed over her often enough to remind the entire court that she no longer stood among the forgotten. Her quiet ascent had already unsettled the familiar structure of the court, reshaping how every gesture around her was interpreted. A muted tension began to hover in the air, suggesting that further changes might surface without warning. That tension carried a question no one dared voice, hinting that her story still held turns capable of bending the palace's balance in unexpected ways. The shift could be felt long before anyone spoke it aloud. a quiet draining of attention as the boy's absence began to stretch from days into something heavier. A mother who once walked through corridors under a soft shield of significance now moved through them as though the light had thinned around her. Servants, who previously bowed a fraction deeper, gave only the bare minimum. The subtle recalibration happened quickly, almost instinctively, as though the court had been waiting for the moment to restore its old order. The child had been her anchor, the living proof of her relevance, and without him, the foundation beneath her life softened in a way that felt both immediate and inevitable. His death was spoken of politely, but the silence that followed said far more than words could ever hold. She continued to sit where she always sat, at the edge of gatherings, near the carved wooden screens, or by the narrow windows lining the lesser halls. But now no one glanced toward her unless duty demanded it. The loss of a royal son, even one born outside marriage, unsettled the air for a moment. Yet the machinery of the palace absorbed the shock and continued. It was only her position that did not recover. Days passed in a blur of muted footsteps and half-lowered eyes. And with each passing morning, the truth pressed harder, without a living child. Her claim to space, shelter, and recognition was waning. The court, trained to observe advantage, adjusted quickly to the shift. There were traces of her former life still clinging to her, embroidered seams no longer replaced, jewelry left unworn because it no longer aligned with her new standing. Her rooms remained the same size, but somehow felt smaller, as though the walls had grown inward in the night. Courtiers, who once sought her presence, now drifted toward other alliances, following currents that held greater promise. Even the quiet visits from nurses, physicians, and attendants ceased, for their duties were tied to the child, not to her. Without him, their purpose dissolved. Some women in her position chose to wait, hoping the king might offer a gesture of compassion or responsibility. But such gestures rarely came. The king's affection had never been a guarantee. It had been a moment, a preference, a season that shifted with the winds of politics and desire. Without the boy, the connection between them returned to its original fragility. She understood it when she noticed the absence of messengers, the thinning of gifts, and the lack of inquiries after her health. She was once again a figure without formal ties, and the court treated her precisely as such. For some, the only available path was retreat. Monasteries and quiet houses on the outskirts of the realm offered a type of stillness that the palace could not. A woman might enter through a wooden gate, carrying nothing but memories of a life that had once seemed promising. Within those stone walls, days passed according to a rhythm that did not depend on royal whims. Yet even in that silence, the weight of what had been lost did not lighten. She carried the shape of her son's brief life with her, not as a scandal or a political tool, but as the last piece of meaning she had held in the world she left behind. In the palace, her absence caused no ripple. The court closed over such disappearances quickly. New alliances rose. New faces filled the gaps. But for those who had watched her journey, from obscure companion to mother of a royal child, and then back into obscurity, the contrast was hard to ignore. Her fate revealed a truth that lingered beneath every celebration of lineage. A mother's value was tethered not to her own personhood, but to the life of the child she bore. When that child vanished, the structure supporting her identity collapsed. Some women managed to remain, though only for a while, clinging to the faint hope that a memory might hold enough weight to secure their place. But memories held little power in a court driven by strategy and succession. The reality was simple and brutally efficient. Without a living son, she had no claim that anyone was obliged to respect. Lines of blood determined everything, and once broken, they could not be repaired by sentiment or history. Her story faded, not through cruelty, but through the quiet, steady erosion of interest. The palace returned to its routines, and she became a figure kept only in the dimmest corners of recollection. Years later, A name might surface in an archive, connected to a son who did not survive, and scholars might remark on her brief brush with influence. Yet the lived experience, the loneliness, the withdrawal, the acceptance of erasure, remained unseen, absorbed into the long shadows cast by the dynasty she once touched. Her fall from favour revealed how fragile her standing had always been, collapsing the moment her child was no longer there to anchor her presence. A quieter emptiness settled around her steps, hinting that the court had already begun to rearrange itself without her. That emptiness carried a faint disturbance, suggesting that the shifting power after the king's death might erase her even further than grief already had. When the king's breath faded, and the court entered its practiced ritual of mourning, the first thing to vanish was often not the crown, but the fragile security surrounding the women who had borne his sons. Their position had always depended on a single man's gaze, and when that gaze was extinguished, the corridors they once walked with caution became unfamiliar terrain. The power that shielded them dissolved quietly, as if it had only ever been held together by the warmth of his attention. Once that warmth was gone, the palace revealed how indifferent it could be. The shift was never loud. It moved softly, through servants who no longer greeted them with lowered eyes, through guards who stepped aside more slowly, through ladies who once whispered politely, but now offered only thin, en distant glance. The silence that followed the king's death carried a disturbing clarity. Everyone knew the rules. Without him, the mother meant nothing unless her son stood strong enough to justify her continued presence. A woman who had once been treated as the vessel of royal blood could, in the span of a single night, become no more significant than a passing shadow. The council acted swiftly, though they rarely admitted it openly. Decisions were made in rooms she was not invited to enter. Her residences were reassigned for the good of order. Her servants were redistributed to more favoured households. The coins allotted to her upkeep began to shrink. These were small movements, each one modest, but together they created a slow, tightening ring around her life. She understood what it meant. The king had been her protection. The new king might not wish to keep the memory of his father's private weaknesses alive. Isolation was the first real blow. She felt it in the way her meals arrived later, in the way her name slipped further down the list of those permitted to attend ceremonial gatherings. She felt it in the gardens, where no one approached unless duty forced them to. The court no longer needed her presence, and because it did not need her, it preferred not to see her at all. The silence that wrapped around her was colder than hostility. It was simply absence, a quiet erasing. For some women, the presence of a strong son changed everything. If he had already secured favour, alliance, or titles, his mother could stand beside that rising power and remain visible. His assent became her shield, proof that her existence still fit within the court's structure. People bowed again, but not to her. They bowed to the reflection of her son's authority, and if he was clever, or ruthless, or beloved, she found her place preserved for a little longer. But when the son was young, or sickly, or politically inconvenient, her future darkened quickly. She might be sent to a distant estate for her health, or quietly encouraged to seek the stillness of a convent. The court had perfected the art of removing women without force. They simply allowed neglect to do the work. Rooms she once filled with cautious pride were given to others. Her jewels disappeared into the crown vaults for safekeeping. Her identity diminished into a footnote designed for swift forgetting. The most painful part was not the loss of luxury. It was the realization that the kingdom she had once helped shape through her child's birth now had no space left for the mother who bore him. She might be remembered privately by a few. An old maid, a sympathetic clerk, a childhood servant. But the institution itself had no interest in preserving her name. She had served her purpose. The king who validated her existence had left the world, and the world moved on without her. Those who survived these years learned to expect nothing. They lived quietly, watching the tides of power shift around them. Understanding that each shift threatened to erase them further, they had carried royal blood into the world. But in death, the king reclaimed all that had once belonged to him, including the attention that had kept them alive within the palace walls. The court forgot quickly. Forgetting was its most reliable form of self-protection. It was a strange cruelty. A woman could alter the dynasty's future through a single birth, yet find herself discarded the moment that future no longer depended on her. In the stillness after the king's passing, she learned how little she had ever been allowed to hold. Her fading presence revealed how swiftly the court abandoned those no longer useful, turning yesterday's significance into today's silence. A quiet shift in power hinted that the final truths of her story had yet to settle. Some distance in that silence suggested that what remained for her might be darker than mere forgetting. They moved through the Tudor world without titles, estates, or the jeweled crowns that defined a woman's worth at court. And yet, their presence lingered in places the records never fully captured. The women who bore the sons of kings existed in the spaces between ceremony and secrecy, neither recognized nor entirely dismissed. Suspended in a quiet realm where influence hid beneath the surface. History rarely spoke their names, but their absence was impossible to ignore. A dynasty could rise or fracture because of a child they brought into the world. And still, they remained unnamed shadows behind the throne. Their lives left only faint traces. An entry in a royal account book, a grant of land, a passing reference in a nobleman's letter. These fragments were all that survived of the women who altered the kingdom's shape. They were not granted official positions. Yet the corridors of power bent subtly around them, shifting to accommodate the existence of their sons. Their voices rarely appeared in the documents of the age, but the choices they made, from whom they trusted to how they guided their children, had consequences that stretched far beyond their own small rooms. It is difficult to picture their days without imagining the tension coiled beneath every gesture. A single glance from a counselor could signal approval or impending danger. A whisper carried across a hallway could be a rumor or a warning. They lived in a world where the line between privilege and exile was as thin as the letters written in the king's hand. When fortune favored them, they were treated with the courtesy they had never earned by law. When fortune turned, they were left with nothing but the echo of their child's once promising future. And yet, even in their enforced silence, they shaped the kingdom's story. They raised sons who would influence battles, treaties, and successions. They comforted children whose names would later be invoked in moments of national triumph or disaster. They taught them loyalty, ambition, fear, or caution, qualities that embedded themselves into the decisions of princes and, later, powerful men. Their guidance became an invisible thread woven through the tapestry of Tudor history, altering its patterns in ways no chronicler could fully trace. The court may have preferred to overlook them, but the truth lingered in every generation that followed. A king's bloodline was never just the king's alone. It carried whispers of the women who sustained it. Some of these women retired into quiet estates, living out their years in slow disappearance. Others slipped into religious houses where no one asked questions and no one offered answers. But the world outside still remembered them in subtle ways. A gesture from their grown son, the tilt of his head, the phrasing of a command. These small things hinted at the private world that shaped him long before the crown rested on his future. No inscription was carved for them in Westminster. No herald announced their lineage. Yet history has a way of circling back, uncovering the forgotten, and noticing the overlooked. As centuries passed, scholars and storytellers began to trace the outlines of these women, not because the court had preserved their legacies, but because the human mind instinctively seeks the missing pieces. Every prince must come from somewhere. Every political shift must have an origin. And behind so many pivotal moments were women the world was not meant to see. Their power was never supposed to survive beyond their child's early years. But power, once awakened, rarely behaves as expected. Some mothers influenced their sons with a quiet determination that outlived kings, queens, and rival factions. Their lessons did not fade when the king died or when the court turned its back. Instead, they settled deep within the next generation, carried forward by memory and emotion rather than decree. Their presence was not recorded, yet it was felt, an invisible architecture beneath the visible structure of Tudor authority. It is tempting to call them victims, but that word is too small. They endured, adapted, and learned to navigate a world that offered them little in exchange for everything they provided. They were denied recognition, but not significance. They vanished from official records, but not from the lineage they had helped create. History forgot their names, but never escaped their impact. This contradiction is what makes their story so unsettling and so compelling. They lived in the margins, yet shaped the center. And so, in the end, they remain uncrowned, uncelebrated, and yet undeniably present. Their existence may be blurred, but it has not been erased. Their shadows still stretch across the Tudor landscape, quiet reminders that the most influential figures are not always the ones seated on the throne. Sometimes they stand just behind it. Unseen, but indispensable, they seem to disappear when their usefulness ended. Yet their influence continued to pulse through the reigns that followed. A faint residue of their choices lingered around the men who once relied on them, suggesting that their silence had never meant absence. That subtle echo invites a final question. How many of history's turning points were shaped by hands no one bothered to record? And now, as this story settles into quiet, you might feel the way I do, that the forgotten corners of history often hold the deepest truths. Tonight, let those shadows rest softly around you, like pages closing in a dim room where the candles have burned low. Thank you for listening, for staying, for breathing life into voices long overlooked. May your night be peaceful, and may sleep find you easily. Good night.